is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Millions of people across Africa today yearn for a place to call home. According to the United Nations, as many as 5 million people across the continent are currently living as refugees, often forced to flee their home countries due to conflict and food insecurity. The refugee crisis in Africa is not new. Humanitarian agencies and host governments have for decades tried to find solutions to a recurring problem. But with ongoing conflicts, climate change, and economic hardship still a reality for many across the continent, the issue remains unresolved. This week on the program, we look at what the future may hold for refugees who for decades have called these camps home. What are their legal rights and what long-term solutions can be put in place to end the refugee crisis across the continent? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, Kenya currently hosts the two largest refugee camps in the world, Kakuma and Dadaab. Both were established in the early 1990s to provide shelter to an influx of refugees fleeing Sudan and Somalia, respectively. Before we get into our discussion, let's take a brief look at the history of the two camps.
Kakuma Refugee Camp was established in 1992 to house Sudanese refugees who were forcibly displaced from their homes due to conflict and persecution. It has since expanded to include people fleeing from several other East and Central African countries. It's located in Turkana County in northwestern Kenya, and according to the United Nations is home to about 200,000 refugees. Dadaab Refugee Camp is in northeastern Kenya and is comprised of 3 camps, Ifo, Hagadera, and Dagahale. It was set up in 1991 to house about 90,000 Somali refugees fleeing civil war in neighboring Somalia. Today, it also houses nationals from other countries in the Horn of Africa who fled war and starvation in their home nations. At its height, it was estimated to house over 500,000 displaced people. The camps were initially set up as temporary accommodation run by the Kenya government and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, but have since developed into sprawling towns. They have schools, economic activities, and their own elected community volunteers who help the UN run the camps. The camps have now been in existence for 4 decades, and for many, this is the only home they have ever known. Some refugees have married, with second and third generations being born and continuing to live in the camps. Many wonder what would happen to them if the camps are closed and they are forced to return to their countries of origin.
And joining me now to unpack the refugee crisis in Africa, Dr. Hassan Kanenje. He is the director, Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies, and Victor Nyamori, a researcher and advisor on refugees and migrants' rights at the Amnesty International. To you both, gentlemen, welcome and thank you very much for joining us on Talk Africa. Victor, let me start off with you because I want to look at the background of Kenya's refugee camps. Kenya holds some of the largest refugee camps in the world. Both have been in place for about 30 years. In theory, refugee camps are supposed to be temporary spaces created for emergency response. Why is the Kenyan refugee situation so challenging?
I mean, the refugee situation is quite a complex situation in Kenya. I mean, Kenya has hosted refugees for the last 30 years. But then in this current situation, Kenya is seen as a good host at times because for the number of years it has hosted refugees. But then also quite a challenging situation because with the high number of refugees that are here, Kenya is currently facing a number of challenges in this process. And that's why recently you find that the Kenyan government gave an order for the closure of the camp. But this is not the first time. It has happened before, and we are really worried of the situation currently.
But before we go to how many times Kenya has asked the UNHCR to close down the camps, I want to go back to what you're talking about, this being a complex situation. If you look at where Somalia is today. Somalia is no longer at civil war. So why is it difficult for Somali refugees, for instance, to return to their home countries? And South Sudan has had independence since 2011. Why has it been a challenging situation to repatriate?
I mean, take you back to our history a bit so that you understand. I mean, conflict happened because of different reasons, and people flee their country because of different reasons. An individual person might be fleeing because of FGM in a particular family household, One might be leaving because they are being forced to marry, different issues. So the conflict in Somalia, the conflict in South Sudan drove a large number of refugees in the country. In terms of returning back to their countries, where the people should be able to return back, it's in the human rights sector, we call it a voluntary process. Once a country accepts you into the country to host you as a refugee,
Right.
you acquire a legal status that it's protected internationally. But then if you want to leave or go back to your country, then you should go back voluntarily and not be pushed. But then that means individual persons in the refugee camp, the individual person in the refugee camp makes a conscious decision that is well informed, not pushed by anybody, to go back to their country where they're coming from. And that is the situation currently we are facing.
Dr. Kanenje, let me get it from your perspective. Let's look at this from a humanitarian and a conflict-related perspective. Why have Kenyan refugee camps been in place for so long, and where does this leave Kenya?
Thanks, Beatrice. That's a very good question. One thing that has been challenging is the continued and intractable conflict, of course, in Somalia, in South Sudan, and other neighboring countries. Now, such conflict does not create conducive environment for repatriation of refugees. And so the conflict situation, especially in the Horn of Africa, has been a gift that keeps on giving when it comes to pushing the refugees to look for safer haven. And of course, Kenya has been one of the safest havens for the longest time. Now, this also poses a challenge, of course, in the long term.
Right, but Victor is talking about voluntary repatriation, that one cannot be forced to return to their home of origin if they deem that it is not safe. This is not the first time that Kenya is asking authorities at the UNHCR to make plans to close the two main refugee camps, and they have stated their case, but it still is quite a complex issue. Talk to us about that.
I think after 30 years of hosting refugees, and at some point Dadaab was one of the world's largest refugee camps, I think there is what I would call refugee fatigue among host countries, not just Kenya. And a sense that perhaps the international community and UNHCR are not doing enough to be able to create an environment that can actually allow for voluntary return of refugees to their home countries. And so refugees are finding themselves in crossfire between the frustration of host countries on one hand and the inadequate or unfavorable conditions for return to home countries on the other hand. And it's an unfortunate situation, but I think it's a situation the international community has to pay attention to. They already haven't started doing that, especially to the African continent. We've not seen as much focus and investment even within the UNHCR itself to get enough resources to be able to undertake those processes.
Victor, is there a case of a refugee fatigue here? What exactly is the UNHCR and the Somali government, what are they doing to encourage repatriation of their citizens?
Well, I don't want to speak for UNHCR here, and neither in terms of or the Somali government. But in our position in terms of Amnesty International, I mean, we note that Kenya has a responsibility to host refugees. Indeed, that is not a process that they can handle alone. The African situation, like has been mentioned by Dr. here, is that everybody has a responsibility to protect people within the continent and within the region. But by that fact, that means that when you're hosting refugees, refugees have solutions that are available for them. One, specifically in terms of durable solution, like local integration. Refugees have been here for quite a number of years. In the 70s, we had refugees from Sudan, and some of them were actually living in towns and not in the camps. and they were actually teachers and they were teaching in universities around here. But the current situation, when Kenya changed its policy to host refugees in the camp, it changed the dynamic, and now we are seeing a group of people, about 430,000 living in the camps, that making Kenya, in terms of logistically planning, security planning, a bit of a difficult situation. So in terms of solution, my call is that Kenya has a responsibility also to help in the process of finding solution. One, the issues of voluntary repatriation that we had mentioned before. Two, is the fact that Kenya has a responsibility to ensure that its engagement nationally, globally, and internationally, international community has a role to play in terms of supporting, giving the fair share here. That means by offering resettlement opportunity to third countries that have been staying here, but also giving enough financial support to the humanitarian situation here.
Right. I want to get Dr. Kaneji's reaction to that, because there are several points Victor has raised here, that Kenya is only receiving about 20% funding, and that the rations for the refugees is actually quite minimal. Dr. Kaneji, life in the camps themselves are a concoction of congestion, deplorable conditions, restricted movement, and reliance on that aid that Victor has talked about. So what is really contributing to this apparent motivation to sustain the refugee camps in Kenya?
First of all, there's international complacency when it comes to the situation of refugees generally. Now, it's important for the audience to know that, or to understand that 85% of the world refugees are in developing countries. 80% of these countries themselves are facing food shortages. They're facing climate conditions that are not very favorable, and they just do not have the capacity, frankly, to keep refugees in the long run. And so when you look at a case, for instance, of the Horn of Africa, and especially the refugees in Kenya, majority of the refugees in Kenya come from Somalia, because others come from South Sudan and the neighboring countries, but an overwhelming majority. Now, Somalia is not anywhere, while there is a sense that's no longer at war. Somalia is a country in conflict. It's a country, in fact, with the emergency and the Al-Shabaab insurgency, it has made conditions actually worse for the return of refugees. And so the climate is not good for repatriation. These people, most of them do not really have a place to go or where to start. Neither is their safety or security guaranteed when they go back. Now, on the other hand, perpetual refugee status is not something sustainable for the host country. It is something that, there has to be a way of sharing the burden and more international assistance when it comes to this condition of refugees in ways. If you're going to have, for instance, integration programs, how is that going to work? And how are countries going to share that burden? Because you cannot expect one country, for instance, to take in, 500,000 and try to integrate that. It's going to be a logistical, cultural, and economic nightmare.
Dr. Kaneje, you've talked at length about repatriation, but there are three situations that, in terms of refugee resettlement: repatriation, integration into the local community, and resettlement in a third country. Now, we haven't heard much about the resettlement option. Where are we with the progress on that?
Actually, the spirit of resettlement that we witnessed in the 90s and 2000s has taken a back seat. In fact, it's gone backwards. And the reason is the rising, what I call political and economic populism, especially in the West, has led to policies that are anti-immigration. And so what do you do when you're having vulnerable populations that do not have a country? They cannot go back to their country of origin, and they need a third country in the work of increasing resistance to immigration, especially of vulnerable populations. And so the project or the prospects of resettling in third countries has become dimmer. What we are hoping is perhaps in the work of the new realities, that countries are going to be a little bit more open, and the kind of political populism, especially anti-immigrant rhetoric that we're seeing around the world, is going to reduce, so that at least refugees can have a future. Just to give an example, not too long ago, refugees from a number of countries were banned from entering the United States, at least the better part of the last 4 years. that does not bode well for the condition and the situation of refugees around the world.
All right, Dr. Kanyeje and Victor Nyamori, do stay with us. We'll continue with this discussion in just a moment. Very insightful discussion on the refugee situation in Kenya. We'll take a short break now. When we come back, we'll look at possible solutions to Africa's refugee crisis. Stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Still with me on the program, Dr. Hassan Kaneje and Victor Nyamori. Now, before the break, we looked at some of the causes and challenges of Africa's refugee crisis. Let's now look at some possible long-term solutions to the problem. And Victor, let me refer to what you said at the beginning in terms of Kenya's responsibilities towards the refugees and the camps. Because according to the 1951 Refugee Convention, United Nations, a refugee should not be returned to a country where they face serious threats to their lives and freedoms. In that sense, though, legally, what are Kenya's options here?
In terms of long-term solution for the refugee situation, it is true. I mean, Kenya has an obligation to protect refugees in the country, signed international law, not only the 1951 Convention, but also the 1969 OAU, now the African Union Convention that protects refugees. The Kenyan carried options that it cannot force people back to their country of origin. That is the law. The law is very clear on that. And if at all it is using security as an excuse for pushing people out of the country, then I will refer Kenya back to a judgment that was issued some time back by Justice Mativo that required that in case anybody is seen as a security threat, then it should be an individual process. Kenya should be able to deal with that specific person individually, but not lumping a group of over 200,000, over 500,000 refugees and taking them because of the ills of one particular individual.
Dr. Kaneje, your thoughts on that, because Kenya has wanted to close the camps for some time, citing a terrorist, the terrorist group Al-Shabaab operating from one of the camps, the Dadaab refugee camp. Is Kenya, though, obliged now to host these refugees for decades, despite having these reservations?
Refugees in perpetuity is not a sustainable proposition for any country. And I don't think the refugees enjoy being refugees themselves, nor do the host countries enjoy hosting refugees, because these are people who can contribute to their economies, whether for the host countries or for the home countries. Now, one of the reasons cited by Nairobi is the threat of Al-Shabaab. And indeed, there is, to their credit, there is credible evidence that 2013 and 2015 terrorist attacks were in part planned, of course, in these refugee camps. And so that poses security to the host countries. It's not just to Kenya. We've seen Al-Shabaab attack not just Somalia, Kenya, but they've attacked Uganda too. And so Nairobi would have some legitimate concern when it comes to that. But critically important, what we need to understand is the existing camps have been around for 30 years, some of the longest, living refugee camps in the world. That is not something that is sustainable in the long run, and it's not even sustainable at the moment. And so while Nairobi is signatory to the convention, and part of the ruling of 2016, of course, pointed to that in terms of voluntary repatriation of refugees and when circumstances dictate, I think sustaining the kind of status quo that we have right now, whether in Kenya or in the region, is not going to be tenable. And what we may see later on is host countries perhaps taking unilateral action, of course, against some of the provisions that are supposed to protect refugees.
So, Dr. Kaneja, if the current situation is no longer tenable, then what does the future hold for the refugees themselves?
The future is bleak, and especially for for Kenyan refugees, for instance. Uh, the situation in Somalia is only getting worse. I think those who are paying attention to even political developments in the last few days, you realize there is a lot of tension, and there is increased likelihood of conflict. And so, is that a place refugees can go back to? Certainly not. Now, to make it worse, when countries that are hosting countries, a host country and the source country are not even in talking terms, they don't have arrangements that they can cooperate when it comes to repatriation of refugees, it makes it virtually impossible to actually safely be able to repatriate refugees or even the refugees themselves to voluntarily want to return home. And so it is not a very good picture for the refugees. And a lot of it has to do with what I'll call international complacency and refugee fatigue, and especially when it comes to African refugees, which is something that has to be discussed honestly and frankly.
All right. Victor, that thought there about international complacency, I mean, at the moment, of course, many countries are dealing with their own internal challenges brought about by COVID-19, and perhaps not a lot of interest will be given to the refugee situation. Where does a permanent solution, though, lie when it comes to the refugee crisis, not only in the Horn of Africa region, but also in the Great Lakes?
Kenya has played a great role internationally. It's currently sitting at the Security Council. We have a situation like a few years ago, there was a particular signing of a particular document known as the Global Compact for Refugees and the Global Compact for Migrants sometimes. These are not binding documents, but it offered a roadmap into calling on countries to support refugees, but not only, especially countries that are hosting large number of refugees. So some of the things that were mentioned in that document, and Kenya played a key role in also in this document, is that to ensure that as much as refugees are hosted in the country, they start being integrated at the earliest time possible. Meaning, as you are doing away with the camps, allow refugees to be able to access opportunity that can build their livelihood, allow them to access work, allow them to access schools without any challenges, allow them also to access the job market when when it allows, but also giving them technical skills that they can also use not only in the host country, but also across the region. In the region here currently, IGAD is leading a number of discussions that involves integration of refugees. And I would urge Kenya to be able to be strictly involved in those processes. Some years back, our president here hosted president from the region and called for proper durable solution for Somalia. And the three durable solutions still holds. I mean, there was discussion on how to ensure that Somalia is safe for safe and dignified return voluntarily. There was discussion to ensure that countries where Somalis are being hosted
Right.
give opportunity to access better services and other opportunities that increase their livelihood. And also there was a discussion on how international community should be able to fund these operations very well.
Right. Dr. Khaneja, should Kenya's refugee camps then become a part of a sustainable future for refugees in this case?
I don't think right now there is a framework and capacity to be able to do that. Part of the risk has been, making refugee problem and just refugees as a way to benefit by humanitarian profiteers. And this is something we also have to pay close attention to. Kenya, at the moment, while it has certain obligations, of course, under the conventions that were signed, just like other developing countries, it lacks the kind of capacity to host refugees in perpetuity. I think what was mentioned earlier is even the ratios going to refugees have now, reduced. Now, as a developing country that itself is facing, economic hardship in the wake of the pandemic, of course, which has made the situation of refugees even worse, unless there is a collective effort by the international community to address the problem and a framework in either sharing the burden by, sharing these refugees with other countries, a framework that can address the root causes of the conflict in the region. So we do not have to see influx of refugees every so often. It's going to be increasingly difficult for Nairobi to be able to do it alone, or any other country for that matter, especially in the developing world, that lack resources and capacity to be able to take care of refugees.
So in terms of that collective responsibility, as you mentioned, unless there is a collective responsibility, who should be held accountable in this situation?
I think all stakeholders. And stakeholders, the number one stakeholders is where the source country of refugees. The leadership in those countries have to be brought to attention, and if it means, be forced to make peace and create circumstances that can allow the people not to leave those countries, but also to be repatriated. Number two, the international community and people who are involved in this agenda, they have to pay their fair share when it comes to taking care of refugees. Refugees is not a problem of one country, and therefore it should not be left for one country. Number four, of course, there are host countries that have a responsibility, of course, under international humanitarian law in treating them well, but also not, of course, using them in a way as if, using them as a pawn for political purposes. Now, it is critically important that, we understand that generally the environment, especially the conflict environment in the Horn of Africa and the Great Lakes region, has been a fertile source of these refugees. And unless some of these root causes are honestly addressed and sufficiently with sticks and carrots when it comes to political players, the problem of refugees by and large is going to be with us in years and decades to come.
Victor, you've heard Dr. Kanenje's thoughts on the accountability of the situation. You have the final word on this.
Very strongly. I mean, I'm a person who believes on human rights, protection of principles, protection of individuals who are seeking support. And we did a survey some time back and asked Kenyans if they are willing to host people who are running away from conflict, from trouble and all that. I mean, the thing is, general Kenyans will welcome people who are facing challenges. So it is the obligation of the government to ensure that in all this process, while welcoming people, it protects its citizens, but also give the strangers, especially the refugees, an opportunity to thrive in the country by allowing them to access to support, so access, livelihood access, opportunity to thrive, do business, and build their economy. And Kenya will likely benefit more from this situation, unlike the current situation where we are blocking opportunities to return people and calling for the return of people back to their countries.
Very interesting discussion indeed on the refugee crisis. But that's all we have time for this week on the program. Thank you to my guests for your insights. Dr. Hassan Kanenje, Director, Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies, and Victor Nyamori, Researcher and Advisor on Refugee and Migrant Rights at the Amnesty International. Remember, we'd love to hear your feedback through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. And keep the conversation going, and do tune in again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team in Nairobi, stay safe and goodbye.